Cincinnati. Her name is Patricia Van Skyke. She was appointed as into the executive director position earlier this year, and she had previously served as a manager of genealogy and local history department of the public library in Cincinnati and Hamilton County. And then she has received the Hamilton County Recorder's Griffin Yateman Award for Historical Preservation, as well as the Distinguished Presenter Award from Routes Tech. That's a conference devoted to family history and technology. But she's very well versed in history and everything that she's facing. Maybe she wasn't so versed in, coming all the way over to Boone County. But we're so glad, Pat, that you're here to share with us the story of John Uri Lloyd. Patricia Van Skyke, everybody.
I just had to be down here.
Okay, I'll go over there. Sure.
Okay. I'll hand this up. A couple steps. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good
For
evening.
those of you, can you hear me okay? Yeah. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Lloyd Library is an independent research library with a focus on plants. We are over 100 years old, and our collections date back to the 1400s, and they come all the way up to the present time. Our materials are used by scientists, medical researchers, artists, medical practitioners, and of course historians, which is a special fondness for me. In fact, earlier this summer we did a survey of all of our users, and we asked them one of these check all boxes that apply. What are you interested in? And it didn't matter if it was a scientist or an artist. History was one of the things that was the unifying theme. As I said, we have a wide array of people that use our collections. We also have gardeners, environmentalists, ecologists, basically anybody that has any interest in plants in any way, how they are used, have been used, currently being used, come to visit our library and exhibit area museum. The Lloyd Library was founded by three brothers that were pharmacists, and that might seem a little odd to you that a plant library would be founded by pharmacists. But actually, if you go back to the beginning of botany as a field in the 15 and 1600s, it was always linked to the apothecary schools. In fact, initially, the value of plants was, how can they make us better? How can we, what's the healthy aspect of it? How can they serve as medicine? So the three brothers, the three Lloyd brothers, were born in upstate New York. They moved to this area, they lived here, and they worked across the river in Cincinnati. The oldest brother, John Uri Lloyd, he of the three had the furthest reach and widest reputation, was the scientist. He researched and developed plant-based medicine. In fact, he had hundreds of patents, but if you think that he only had patents for his medicine, he also had patents for the equipment that he used to create the medicine. In fact, something known as the cold still. Now, the cold still didn't have anything to do with moonshine. It had to do with how he made the plant-based products so he wouldn't destroy the medicinal properties of the plants. And the underpinnings of that were actually used that same sort of technology to develop Taxol, treatment for breast cancer, based on the cold still, and also Taxol, as you know, many of you know, I'm sure, is plant-based. So it's kind of interesting that 100 years later we have both his technology and the idea of plant-based medicine coming sort of full circle for cancer treatment. He not only researched and developed pharmaceutical products, but they manufactured them. In fact, they were very, very successful. My pharmacist, who is 92 years old, Woody Pack, actually remembers selling Lloyd Brothers medicines in his pharmacy when he first opened up. So they were manufactured actually right across the street from where the Lloyd Library is today. John Uri Lloyd also was a professor. He taught at the Eclectic Medical School, which is, today we would define that, again, plant-based medicine, we would define that as sort of the natural health movement. But before we sort of put him into a box, and I think we'll see this more tonight as being this sort of science nerd, he also was very multi-dimensional. He was a novelist and considered one of the early science fiction writers. And again, I think we'll get a little bit better picture of the full John Uri Lloyd. The youngest brother, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was an ethnobotanist. And that term didn't even exist when he was doing it. What an ethnobotanist is somebody that basically combines the fields of botany and anthropology. So they're not just caring about this plant grows in this environment, but it's how are the people using it. And Curtis Gates Lloyd had a particular interest, and that was fungi or mushrooms. So he traveled the world, very remote regions of the world, some places where nobody of European descent had even explored yet, looking for mushrooms and also recording how people were using them. He also was a huge naturalist, and so some of you are probably familiar with the Curtis Gates Lloyd Nature Preserve that's not too far from here. And the youngest, or the middle brother, Nelson Ashley, was a businessman. So you can imagine these skills, have a businessman, you've got sort of the perfect formula, if you will. He was a founding owner of the Cincinnati Reds, and he built the Palace of the Fans, which was where Crossley, first stadium and where Crossley Field would eventually stand. So quite a unique group of men that started this institution that we're so glad to have today. Tonight, we are going to meet the motivating force behind the Lloyd Brothers and the Lloyd Library. In fact, it is my pleasure to welcome the distinguished pharmacist, scientist, author, and businessman, Professor John Uri Lloyd, in person. Mr. Lloyd?
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Van Skyke. And thank you, Ms. Conrad, for having me here this evening. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here this evening. Indeed, under the circumstances, I'm very glad to be here anywhere at all. But I'm particularly gratified to be here among this group of citizens of northern Kentucky, where I spent my early youth. The citizens who are passionate about the history of this area where I grew up before moving on just a little north to make some history of my own by founding and building an important pharmaceutical company and library and museum not all that far away from where we stand right now. Preserving and sharing local history, as you folks are so dedicated to doing, is terribly important. If you don't know where you have come from, how will you ever figure out where you're going? Being dedicated to local history in a time of sound bites and social media must be a particular labor of love. So I tip my hat indeed to the stalwart devotees of the Boone County Historical Society and congratulate you on your interest and efforts to preserve your local history. I'm also very glad to greet any members of the general public who have joined us this evening for a little enlightenment on the subject of herbal or botanical medicine. Thank you very much for coming. There should, however, be 3 hats being tipped here tonight rather than only one, because my personal achievements during my lifetime, which have prompted you to invite me here this evening, were always in the context of the original Lloyd Brothers pharmaceutical company. And that company was started by 3 brothers, not one, with each of us playing an interesting role in that story. Miss Van Skyke has given you a little taste of that already. I was the oldest and served as the company we founded as scientist, inventor, and public face of the firm. This allowed me to correspond with the national and international figures of my day and help lead the pharmaceutical industry in general, as well as the business of the firm itself. I was even elected president of the American Pharmaceutical Association for a term in 1887-88, which was pretty remarkable, given that my field of pharmacy by then was widely regarded as irregular and non-standard, being eclectic instead of allopathic, as they said. And along the way, I wrote a series of novels which attracted some attention at the time, but I gather not too much read in your time, but maybe you should try getting into one. Isn't there some kind of advertising slogan that says, try it, you'll like it? Well, the second brother, Nelson Ashley, was our chief business manager, and he was the anchor to running the firm. Built a beautiful house called Honeoye in the East Walnut Hills section of Cincinnati around 1905, which was eventually inherited by his daughter, whose grandsons remember going there for family holiday dinners. I understand one of them is with us tonight and will be introduced later. The third and youngest brother was Curtis Gates. Now, Curtis was our chief botanist as well as a mycologist, traveling worldwide to collect both plants and books and of course mushrooms and other materials recording the lore and literature about plants which might be useful as medicines. But not traveling the world for this purpose, he actually resided on the company premises next to his beloved herbarium. And it was Curtis who asked Ashley and me to buy out his share of the company in 1918 so he could concentrate on just the library and his herbarium, arranging the year before, that would be in 17, that he would leave his eventual estate in trust to endow the Lloyd Library when he died in 1926. So the Lloyd Library and Museum is a memorial to the 3 of us, not just me. And if Ashley and Curtis were here with me today, I know they would join me in admiring how effectively the place carries on the traditions of we started and how well it is serving the wider world in the new and challenging century. But it occurs to me that some details of my personal story may be of interest to this gathering, not only because of how that story led to the Lloyd Library and Museum, as it exists today in Cincinnati, but because of how it may in a way represent the story of the American dream, wherein a country boy goes into the city to seek his fortune and ends up doing well by doing good. Now this is an old-fashioned concept, but I am old-fashioned. How could I be otherwise, since I was born some 165 years ago now? Maybe some of you are as well. Well, I was born on April 19th, 1849 in the little town of West Bloomfield in the Genesee Valley of upstate New York. Or so I'm told. I'm afraid I don't remember the event very clearly at all. My father, of course, was a Lloyd. His Christian name was Nelson, but my 2 grandfathers were named John Lloyd and Uri Webster. So their names were combined for me as the firstborn. The next child was Nelson, from our father. I can't tell you where Curtis's name came from. It must have come from somewhere. Our mother, Sophia, was of course a Webster, and father was an engineer and surveyor by trade, while mother was a school teacher. Both were graduates of Lima Seminary and College in that area.
In 1853, Father accepted a surveying job out west, as they said, surveying the route for a proposed new railroad line between Covington, Kentucky and Louisville. So off we went to Burlington in Boone County. Sound familiar? Kentucky south of Cincinnati. Unfortunately, a financial panic caused the railroad project to be abandoned. So my father went into school teaching instead of teaching alongside my mother. But Father still did some surveying work in the summer to supplement the family income. So I grew up in rural northern Kentucky with the family moving from time to time before ending up in Crittenden, off of course, what you all call I-75 in the modern time. Now, I had no great education by modern standards. As a child, I was sickly and with asthma and inclined to be bookish and introspective. I lived in the country surrounded by nature and spent my spare time rambling around the countryside, exploring the natural world around me. The usual pastimes of baseball and other sports were not for me. This was not so true of my brother Ashley. In later years, as you heard, he was part owner of the Cincinnati Reds baseball team and later on the New York Giants. Well, different strokes for different folks, as they say. Well, the result of this exposure to the natural world was an early awareness on my part that at bottom all life on earth is based on chemistry. And chemistry became my lifelong pursuit and passion. Even when I was too young to be enrolled in formal classes in chemistry, I thought of nothing else, which of course led to home experiments, in which such exhibition substances as oxygen and hydrogen were conspicuously entertaining. Boys will be boys, as they say. Now, I had no glass tubes or retorts or other appropriate equipment, but I well remember how I used stems of pumpkin vines as tubes to connect old ink bottles to a pneumatic trough made from my mother's dishpan, Father surreptitiously, of course, in order to collect gases generated by my experiments in my improvised backyard laboratory. For reasons unclear to me at the time, but understandable as I matured, my parents always preferred I do my experiments outdoors. Well, in the summer of '63, my father decided my passion for chemistry made me a perfect candidate for a career in pharmacy. That, in his view, required learning the trade from the bottom up on the job, with any university study to come, if at all, only after I had grounded myself in the basics. This required finding an established apothecary shop or a pharmacist who would take me on as apprentice. The place to find one was in the city, not out here in the country. So very early on a Saturday morning in the fall of '63, my father and I set out for Covington and Cincinnati to look for a position for me. This became a weekly ritual for some months until finally an apprenticeship was secured for me with a pharmacist named William Gordon. Mr. Gordon's shop was at the corner of 8th Street and Western Row in Cincinnati, which is in modern times called Central Avenue, south of the canal, running across the city that defined what was called then, and in your time, over the Rhine. Interestingly, I was first offered a position with Mr. H.M. Merrill, nephew of the afterward famous William S. Merrill, whose shop at the corner of Court and Plum, where the Lloyd Library and Museum stands today. But my father decided I should turn it down because Mr. Gordon warned him that Mr. Merrill's pharmacology was eclectic. This would destroy my future. Little did he know. And so began my apprenticeship with William M. Gordon and Brother. Now, it was not easy for me as a country boy coming into the city, especially from a slave state in the middle of a war being fought over whether slavery should continue to be acceptable or not. The weather on my first day was cold. I wore a heavy gray woolen shawl pinned about my throat, ending near my heels. My clothes were homemade and country style. My manners were country style too. My face was thickly freckled. I was fairly small for my age of 14, even by 19th century standards. All of this made me quite conspicuous in Mr. Gordon's apothecary. So not surprisingly, I was not easily accepted by the other boy apprentices, who were all boys, of course. Even though I like to think I was every bit as good as they were. I was determined at the time that I would become better than they could ever dream of being. And getting better in pharmacy is what I did. First, by learning more and more about the profession, especially under the guidance of Mr. Gordon's assistant, Mr. Riefsnyder. And then by securing Mr. Gordon's consent to transfer to the apothecary of Mr. George Egger, an accomplished German pharmacist, as he was referred to in the community. And accomplished he was. Under his direction, I started to learn how to compound medicines. I studied the origin, uses, history, and doses of more drugs than you can shake a pestle at. I also eventually committed the entire official United States dispensary to memory, all the while attending chemistry lectures by the well-known Mr. Robert Bartholow at the nearby Ohio Medical College. So, in 1867, I received an official certificate of proficiency in pharmacy from Mr. Gordon. I was on my way, or at least I thought I was. Incidentally, during that period of my career, I cherished a personal library of exactly 3 volumes. A copy of the Bible slipped into my valise by my mother as I left home. A copy of a treatise on pharmacy by Mr. Edward Parrish, 1864 edition. And a copy of a manual of elementary chemistry, theoretical and practical, by George Founds, also from '64. These latter two, of course, were basic texts that any aspiring chemist or pharmacist should have, but more about those books in a few moments. My 2 brothers, Ashley and Curtis, of course, have, or at least had, their own stories to tell about how they followed in my footsteps with the encouragement of a father, and coming to Cincinnati from Crittenden, and how I helped them get started in the profession of pharmacy that I was now qualified to pursue. Although for several years Ashley was actually in Illinois due to difficulties he had at first making a go of it in Cincinnati. He finally returned to Cincinnati in 1876. During those early years, my practice of pharmacy brought me into contact with practicing physicians of the day, including 2 in particular who turned out to be keys to my future. They were Dr. John King, Dr. John Milton Scudder. And after observing my performance as a pharmacist for a while, they approached me with a business opportunity I could not resist. These 2 physicians were eclectics and therefore patrons of Mr. H.M. Merrill's pharmacy, which I had avoided by going to work for Mr. Gordon. Doctors King and Scudder were looking for someone they liked and respected to take responsibility at the H.M. Merrill Pharmacy to concentrate on their own particular body of material medica to make pharmaceutical preparations they favored in their eclectic practices. I agreed to take this on and switched my employment to H.M. Merrill as a result. As a matter of general meaning, of course, the word eclectic simply means selective choosing from a wide variety of available sources or systems for application to whatever task or purpose is at hand. In practice, however, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, eclectic, as in eclectic medicine, came to be used to designate a school of medical thought and practice focusing primarily on medicinal preparations derived from plants, that is to say, botanicals. What Doctors King and Scudder were interested in was establishing a formal eclectic pharmacopoeia equivalent to that available for other non-botanical preparations used by mainstream physicians. So with the backing of those 2 good doctors, I went to work for the Merrill firm, and by 1877 had become a partner with the firm then designated Merrill, Thorpe, and Lloyd. This was the beginning of what eventually became Lloyd Brothers Pharmacist firm, which occupied me for the rest of my life. Ashley joined me in 1881 by buying out Mr. Merrill's share, and Curtis joined the firm in 1886. So by then we really were the Lloyd brothers in business together. Curtis became our field representative, traveling the world in search of new plants that we might utilize in our products and securing suppliers from abroad of raw materials. Ashley turned into our business manager, something he had a real talent and feel for, keeping the firm on even keel while always looking for opportunities to extend our distribution network. I myself was the formal head of the company, leading research and development, but also promoting the company nation and indeed worldwide as its public face as the distinguished Professor Lloyd. My correspondence with the influential and famous of the day fills dozens of feet of shelves at the Lloyd Library today. As to what we made, and prospered highly from making, without getting too deeply in the technicalities, I should explain that one major approach to botanical medicines has always been to concentrate a botanical extract in alcohol, the result being called a fluid extract. The firm of Clark Davis and Company at the time offered some 500 such fluid extracts in their catalog for 1885. But our Lloyd Brothers firm actually at that time manufactured over 800 such fluid extracts, well, by the end of the same decade, so we were actually the leader in that kind of thing in those days. But as large as that business was, the jewel in the crown was our extensive line of specific medicines, sometimes referred to as Scudder-specific, remember Dr. Scudder, which, while still constituting concentrated extracts of vegetable origin, were noted for being concentrated at exceptionally high levels by techniques using maceration or percolation, often using the sophisticated cold still that I myself perfected as a basic technique of our manufacturing processes. The benefit of that patented cold still was it limited the use of heat in extracting the ingredient in a plant that we had identified as the source of its medicinal properties. Traditional distillation, of course, involves a lot of heat during the extractive process, which can sometimes reduce the effectiveness of the ingredient that's being concentrated. My cold still used some heat, but to a much lesser degree, and ended up being widely used by other companies as well as ours. These specific medicines of ours, by the way, were not always concentrated in alcohol. Some were simply inorganic acids or salts or dry alkaloids of particular importance to the eclectics, including Drs. King and Scudder, whose work gave us our start. So, of course, if you were wondering about all this, now you know. By the way, there's an actual one of my cold stills down at the Lloyd Library Museum. You can see what it looks like if you go down into Cincinnati and take a look. I'm sure that Mrs. Skyke will be glad to show it to you. Well, one more aspect of our specific medicines may be of interest here. When I first started in pharmacy, the role of the pharmacist was primarily to actually make the medicines requested by the physicians for their patients. That is, many of the medicines were individually compounded in the local apothecary from components and then supplied to the physician for administration to the patient. This accounts in part for there being a drugstore seemingly on every street corner in those good old days, or bad old days, whatever your point of view may be. But our specific medicines didn't need compounding in that sense because they could be diluted by the pharmacist to the strength prescribed and then dispensed, and this made our products very profitable for the pharmacist as well as for the three Lloyd brothers. That development and its extension to pills and capsules fabricated entirely by manufacturers made the kind of intensive training in compounding that I had as a young man eventually irrelevant to modern pharmacy. Well, time moves on. Anyway, as a related matter, our firm's prominence in supplying the needs of practitioners to eclectic medicine early and easily led to our direct support of the Eclectic Medical Institute or College of Cincinnati, and we continued to support that institution until its merger into the College of Medicine at the University of Cincinnati in 1942. I even taught chemistry there for several years. That's how closely we were connected. And of course, that's how I came to be known the world over as Professor Lloyd. I was very fond of that title, actually, especially since I didn't go to undergraduate college, even though both of my parents had college degrees. Anyway, we were very proud of our association and with medical education in that manner, and I would have had very mixed feelings about absorption of that school into the wider mainstream of medical education had I been around to witness it. But then what could be more eclectic than using whatever works? But sometimes it's a botanical still that works best. Remember that, I hope you do. Speaking of my title as professor, by the way, my principal biographer, Michael Flannery, refers to me as the great American eclectic, or the last great eclectic. I will accept those titles. The American Pharmaceutical Association, in awarding me its Remington Medal in 1919, its highest honor, called me the Wizard of American Plant Pharmacy and Chemistry. That, of course, was an indirect comparison with Thomas Alva Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park. Sounds right to me. Well, looking ahead to what happened to the company itself after my death in 1936, since Curtis Gates and Nelson Ashley had already died more than a decade earlier, on my death there were no more Lloyd brothers left, and I directed in my will that the business be sold, although my son John Thomas Lloyd would have preferred to keep it in the family. The winning bid was from the S.P. Pennock Botanical House of New York, and sale was completed in 1938. In 1956, the operation was bought by the Westerfield Company, and in 1960, the German pharmaceutical company Herx purchased what was left of the business and took it elsewhere. How many of the products we developed and sold during family ownership may still be available, I have no idea, but I'm told that the legacy and spirit of the Lloyd Brothers Company still lives on in Sanofi Aventis, which some of you may know as the manufacturer of Ambien, Plavix, and a host of vaccines. As the wise philosopher observed, time flies, they say. Oh no, time stays, we go. Speaking of time, maybe that's enough about the Lloyd brothers and the company we founded and led so usefully for so long. But what about the Lloyd Library and Museum that came out of all this? I mentioned 2 books on chemistry and pharmacy I cherished as my personal library in the 1860s. Those books survived my apprenticeship to eventually enter the library of the firm and then pass into the Lloyd Library, which we established as a separate legal entity in 1898. From that humble beginning, the collection has grown to what I understand is nearly 250,000 volumes on chemistry, botany, medicine, allied fields of study, making it one of the finest collections on things pharmaceutical and natural in North America and perhaps the world. If you're doing research in pharmacy, botany, pharmacognosy, or herbal or alternative medicine, natural products, horticulture, eclectic or sectarian medicine, chances are you'll find what you're looking for at the Lloyd Library. I'm told that some years back, the Library of Congress compiled a list of the 10,000 most important private libraries in the country. The Lloyd came in as number 6. That's pretty impressive, I think. Wow. The Lloyd Library also holds the personal papers of the 3 Lloyd brothers, which makes it even more interesting to me. So, while the Lloyd Brothers Company was a leader in its time, in its day, that time is gone, and the true lasting legacy of the 3 brothers is the Lloyd Library and Museum. It's a great treasure for this area, the nation, and the world. But I should add that while Ashley and I both had important roles in the story, without Curtis traveling the world and collecting books to build the library, and then endowing the result with his personal estate on his death in 1926, it's difficult to imagine that the Lloyd Library and Museum would be existing and prospering as it does in your time. So among the 3 brothers Lloyd, whose lives are memorialized in the name of that wonderful institution, perhaps we should tip our hats the highest to the last born, Curtis Gates. Well, that's enough for this old man. I salute all of you working so effectively to preserve and share the history of this community, and I bid you a very good evening indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lloyd, or rather, Mr. Ford. Our presenter today has been Ashley Lloyd Ford, who, as his full name may indicate, is the great-grandson of Nelson Ashley Lloyd, the second of the 3 Lloyd brothers you have just heard about. And it is his family relationship that makes Ashley particularly eager to appear on occasions like this to share the story of the Lloyd brothers firm and the Lloyd Library and Museum. Ashley hopes that you have enjoyed his impersonation of Professor Lloyd as much as he has enjoyed doing it, and now stands ready to try to answer any questions you may have. He also hopes that you will have a moment to inspect the table display on the Lloyd brothers story that's right here. And I also would like to invite you to visit the Lloyd Library. Thank you. Ashley will now take questions.
Ms. Klotzka, I can ask you to take questions.
Okay.
If there are any. There's one.
Which Lloyd brother did the monument on the road leading out of Crittenden that said at the bottom line, "What fools we mortals be"?
Curtis Grace.
That's Kurt's, yeah.
Has everyone
They
seen
say-
that? That is a very impressive monument.
Does it also say-
with tongue in cheek all the way.
Does it also say he put up because he didn't think anybody else was going to do it?
Sir, I'm not
Something
hearing
like that.
impaired, I'm deaf.
I think it also says he put it up because he didn't think anybody else was going to do it.
Oh.
I think it says something like this, is that right?
Yeah.
How did he become involved with writing the novels? I mean,
You know the story.
That I am actually not that well versed in. I do know that his interests were very wide, but maybe Ashley could speak to a little more.
Michael Flannery is the author of this, you can take a look at it up here, the stand-up biography. That he was a compulsive doer, and when he wasn't doing one thing, he was another. And so late at night, be awake, he'd write novel, he'd just write something. You know, he wasn't in the laboratory. He just, what's the word for polymath? Polymath,
Yeah.
moving on to different things. So he just, and then he really liked writing his novel, and he did them in spurts. But it was just compulsive. He must have slept sometime.
And are you talking about the Springtown novels, or are you talking about the science fiction?
science fiction.
Okay. Again, I think Ashley speaks to that very well in terms of the ones that he did about life in northern Kentucky. It's very interesting. If some of you are aware of like the Foxfire works and some of those books, actually his books were considered sort of the fundamental or the foundation for those, where you actually are capturing the culture and the language and that sort of thing. But the one that you're speaking of, I think Ashley's answer speaks more directly to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Lloyd Wildlife, is that the homestead, and how many acres is there in Crittenden?
David Palmer. Where's David?
I'm right here.
Yeah, when you get the question?
I don't know how many acres. It was that acres, is that the question? I don't know.
David Palmer is the retired assistant superintendent of the Erlanger Ellesmere school system, and he has a passion for the Lloyd story. And if there's anything you want to know about the Lloyd family in northern Kentucky, as opposed to what they did on the other side of the river, and the Rouses too. I mean, he's traced on now. He doesn't live in Boone County; he lives in Kent County. But otherwise, you can love him dearly. But
somebody in the audience said 500, and I was at the Lloyd Reserve just a few weeks ago, and I remember it being several hundred. I think the 500 was the number. So
My son, his property adjoins that, and he laughingly tells people his front yard is 2 acres and his backyard is 500. That's what I
did everybody hear that? So her son adjoins the property, adjoins it.
I'm going to answer a question that I think somebody should ask. What is the take on eclectic versus allopathic medicines, and why was John Uri pursuing the eclectic medicine? My take on the whole story is that the eclectic medicine should have been the dominant form of medicine for the future from the 19th century, because the eclectics had the basic concept of modern medicine, which is that you look for some kind of ingredient or drug or something that works on a specific disease. So you got one thing for poison and ivy, another thing for whatever.
And they did want those ingredients, to find those ingredients in plants. But the allopaths were based on the Greek theory of medicine for 2,000 years, been thinking about the four humors of the body, blood and bile, and two kinds of bile. I can't remember what the four are, but there are four humors. And all diseases were thought to be the byproduct of an imbalance in those humors. And so if you had any particular disease, they'd figure out something that was out of balance in one of the four humors, and they'd give you something to stimulate the humor, called blistering, or to get rid of too much blood by leeches. Nothing to do with what the actual disease was. So that was, looking back at it, it was quackery. And I remember reading a book about 6 kings in France who died in a row, and the 7th didn't, and the biographer said that's because the doctors didn't get there in time. So it's ironic that the eclectics didn't take over the allopaths instead of the other way around. The problem is that the eclectics were not interested in the germ theory, which is a real problem with modern medicine. Yeah. They also didn't want biologics. They don't like biologics and what's the synthetics. Yeah. So they were left by the side of the road on that. Now, in truth, in the final analysis, all medicine converged into sort of basically sort of eclectic, what works, but not in time to save the eclectics, this medical school, which went out of business and whatever that was.
And I wanted to add to that too, because I do strongly agree with that as well. And the allopathic medicine is actually referred to as leeching and bloodletting and that sort of thing, basically says that you poison the sickness out of your body too, and also didn't look at other forms of medicine from around the world, whether they be Asian medicine, Native American, even Appalachian home remedies, that sort of thing. And I think that what we're finding today in the 21st century, we look at things like chemotherapy and that sort of thing, that people are starting to say there are some other answers that don't involve poisoning what's bad out of your body, and let's look to some of these other traditions and see what we can bring in, and many of those are plant-based. So as Ashley said, it wasn't enough to save the eclectic medical movement, but I think very much we do see those sort of things making a revival today. Yes?
I'm going to go ahead and ask, because Mike's going to be the last one.
Okay, somebody over here. He yielded the floor.
I just wondered, what career did you choose?
I was a lawyer for Procter & Gamble for the local soap company.
Following in your father's footsteps.
My father, following in whose footsteps?
Your father's?
No, my father was a doctor, actually. The house, I refer to the grandson being attending holidays at grandfather at Nelson Ashley Lloyd's house. That's, of course, me. I'm the grandson who I remember when I was a kid. Nelson Ashley Lloyd had daughter Marcia, and Marcia Lloyd had inherited the house, married a lawyer, Judge Mills, George E. Mills. And that house is right next to Summit School in Cincinnati. Dr. Henry Heimlich and Mrs. Heimlich lived in that house for many years. And there's a developer fellow has it now, and it's keeping, changing it a bit, but keeping it alive for modern times. But that's my recollection is of childhood. She was, of course, a direct link to Nelson Ashley Lloyd, but I never knew Nelson Ashley Lloyd. There was a clock standing in the hall of that house, and eventually I personally inherited, because nobody else in my family wanted a grandfather clock, and it's currently standing in the Lloyd Library reading room. So if you go down there, you'll see Nelson's clock, which I had in my bedroom for years because nobody else wanted it.
Now, do you call yourself a direct descendant of John Warren?
No, I'm a great nephew.
Okay, what I'm trying to get at.
I'm a great descendant of his brother.
I know where he's at now.
Yeah.
Does anybody know where he's at now?
Well, the Hopeful Church.
Lutheran Cemetery.
Cemetery, right.
And there's about 100 graves.
In the Rouse lot, actually, I think.
No, I think.
Did he buy it?
He
David?
bought it. I don't
Here's
know.
the expert on that.
I'm trying to understand the question. Mr. Ford is, of course, not a direct descendant of John Uri Lloyd. He's a direct descendant of John Uri Lloyd's brother, Nelson Ashley Lloyd. John Uri Lloyd and his wife are buried at Hopeful Lutheran, as well as his first wife. His first wife actually died on their honeymoon. They made a trip to New York, and she passed away on the honeymoon. She was buried at Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. But in the 1930s, after Mrs. Lloyd passed away and was buried at Hopeful, he had his first wife's remains exhumed from Spring Grove Cemetery and moved to Hopeful Road.
The reason I was asking for this, we can't do anything with them. There are about 100 graves there. We can't do nothing with them.
He wrote, what you're saying is he bought a bunch of graves there.
Yeah,
there's
almost
big,
about a third of the
there is
cemetery.
a big, I've referenced that to you. They've got a pretty big piece of real estate there in that cemetery.
Nobody can use it.
Right?
So John Uri bought those graves?
Well, as far as I can ascertain, there are some cornerstones there also,
Yeah.
and actually a sidewalk of rocks that leads to his grave. And so it's a pretty large spot there in the cemetery that evidently was bought by the Lloyds.
Well, there are descendants of John Uri Lloyd still around, mostly in California.
California.
If you're looking for people to sign releases or something, might need somebody to talk to them. I would not have any authority because I'm the collateral.
There's one descendant in California. They found one.
Well, they're children of, I mean, Mrs. Parker is one.
But they found one out there, so they searched to try to find out about it. But nobody, y'all didn't say anything about where he was buried after he died or anything like that. I'd bring it up and hope.
I try not to think about it a lot, actually.
All the local cemeteries got the stone there, and it's as much a memorial as any place else.
There's a question.
There was an auction here in Boone County. It was done at the fairgrounds, and a rouse was involved in it, and came up for sale John Uri Lloyd's baby cup. And I was not thinking about what it was until it was sold. But there was a little baby cup through a rouse.
So how do we know it really was? Because he grew up in upstate New York and they moved around a lot. Maybe they saved it, but
it was through a rouse that had it, but that's where
but the Rouse is the woman he married when he was mature.
well, I mean, maybe carried his baby cup with him all around.
My father kept his baby
Maybe it
shoes.
is. No?
There's spit tune later on.
Yes, sir.
I assume that Lloyd High School is named after John Uri Lloyd.
Correct.
And I wonder how many students in that school are aware of that.
While David was superintendent, everybody was aware of it. Because he did a lot. David even created a memorial exhibit in the hallway of the school. Some of it, I don't know whether those things you donated them or they're on loan, but anyway, there's an exhibit there with another copy of this thing over there.
When was that? When did he do that?
5 years ago? 3 years ago? 2 years ago?
I know what year, when did it happen?
Oh, there's the fellow, you can ask him. David, please.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Well, he was wondering about how much prominence is given to John Uri Lloyd at the Lloyd High School. And in addition to just being named, but there's a display you created.
There is a display there, yes, and there were a number of books that Lloyd donated to the library. The school was built about 14 years before Lloyd passed away, so there were certainly interaction between the students and staff of the school as well as the superintendent. And in regards to the Rouse family,
I'm sorry, hold on. The Lloyd did give the school a trust fund to give an annual award of a Lloyd Medal to an outstanding scholar student, citizen of the school. They still do that every year?
That is...
they ran out of the money stipend, but they still give the award.
The Lloyd Memorial as a donation of money was given, and initially there was a golden award. A student was designated as the winner of that award on an annual basis. and that is still presented to one person in the senior class each year.
So he's still honored,
Yes, he's still honored.
and the student is honored by being associated with John Uri Lloyd.
And as a side note, Lloyd actually set up a similar fund at about the same time at Florence High School. Of course, that school does not exist anymore.
I didn't know that. I graduated from Florence. I didn't know.
Yeah, there was one presented at Florence High School based on donation made there also.
Were you going to make a comment about the Rouse family?
Well, yeah, of course, going back to the Hopeful Church Road, Mrs. Lloyd is the one that wanted to be buried there because
Right,
her
'cause of her
folks
family.
helped establish the
Right.
church there, and there certainly are a number of Rouses that are buried there. Mrs. Lloyd wrote a book about the Rouse family, and it is a very good book in regards to the history of Boone County, because there are so many references to various cemeteries in Boone County, and there are photographs that Mrs. Lloyd took and included in that book that were taken really around the turn of the century, where between 1900 and 1930 or so. And also as a reminder, the novels of John Uri Lloyd that were published by Dodd Mead Publishing House, they were all illustrated by photographs taken by Mrs. Lloyd or Mrs. Rouse Lloyd. And they were all pictures from right here in Boone County. Not only were those fictional novels based on true events in Boone County, but they were illustrated by actual photographs taken in Boone County.
But the church sits on property donated by the Rouse family.
Exactly,
And
exactly, sure
it's
does.
supposed to be, if anything happens to the church, it goes back to that family.
The Rouses are all over the place
Yeah,
at
I
this
know.
point.
Take another question over here.
Taz and Tam.
I just had a comment. I graduated from Lloyd, and of course I had no idea who it was named for. And I also graduated from Marshall University in Huntington. And when I was going to school there, one of the professors made the comment that the mistake that they made was that they didn't use the full name to designate what Marshall it was named for. Well, I could say the same thing about Lloyd. If you wanted to know who it was named for, it should have been named.
I think it is the John Uri Lloyd High School. It's just called Lloyd High School for short.
Well, I've always
Officially,
been
yeah,
Lloyd
officially.
Memorial High School. And I'm like, if you can say Lloyd Memorial, you can say John Uri Lloyd. And that's just my comment was.
Okay.
They should have just
Sorry.
said the whole name.
This is
Well, I know-
honored enough to tell us when we overstayed here, but what?
Well, I just was going to comment that I know a little bit about the Rouse family. And as I've always understood it, sir, the Rouses are the ragweed of taking the county.
No comment.
All righty. Mrs. Conrad, you want to take the floor back here? We can talk all you want, but eventually we'll stop.
We do have, is there any other question or comment? This has been posted. It's hard to top Asa Rouse. That is sure. Well, I just want to say again, thank you so much for being here tonight. And